Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to talk in this forum. And I am delighted. I am especially delighted because my mandate is very eager to strengthen the ties with the civil society and states in the Americas, and this is a very good step. So as Federico said a few minutes ago, I am the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights and cultural diversity. I started my role only 10 months ago. The role is part of the mandate is part of the special procedures in the United Nations. And I'm going to be in this role if everything goes okay for 3 years, and then it is renewable for another 3 years. Special procedures in the United Nations are considered to be the jewel of the United Nations because we are independent experts who focus on a specific human right or a specific mandate that the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council have decided to be of priority. We are 55, there are 55 of us. We are appointed by the Human Rights Council. The mandate, my own mandate, is considered quite new. It started in 2009, and it was the first UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights was from Pakistan and Farida Shahid, and the second one was Karima Benoune from the US and Algeria, and now I took over last year and I am from Greece. I am a professor of human rights law in a British university, so I live permanently in the UK. And no, it is not because of the weather. I am delighted to speak today on cultural rights and to give you my priorities, the priorities that I have. But before I do that, let me just try to share my presentation. Brilliant. Oh, thank you. So I'm just going to tell you next slide, if you don't mind, because I don't think I have control. You have control. Yeah. Shall we start? Shall we start from the front, from the first? Brilliant. Cultural rights have gone through a major overhaul in the last 10, 15 years. Cultural rights have been considered the, quote, Cinderella of human rights. This is how Elsa Stamatopoulou, who was working in the United Nations and who has published a book on cultural rights, has called them. And it was very appropriate because indeed, when we talk about social, economic and cultural rights, we always leave cultural rights aside. But in the last 15, 20 years, and especially with the leading of the indigenous transnational movement, cultural rights have become more visible. And this is what my mandate is eager to continue to do. So if we can move to the next slide, what is very important is to discuss culture. And culture for a long time had this quite elitist meaning, the meaning that we're only talking about important monuments of outstanding beauty. And the living culture, the culture that we have around us, our philosophies, our ways of life, were pushed aside. Since the 1960s, the definition, the meaning of culture has changed. Some states, unfortunately, have not completely have not completely caught up with this more democratic way of looking at culture. And that's why several of us call it the democratization of the meaning of culture. So now culture is, of course, the tangible culture. So, here you have a picture of the Parthenon in Athens. So we talk indeed about monuments of outstanding beauty, but we also talk about monuments that may not be of outstanding beauty, but may be very useful for the community or for the individual. So, but in any case, the tangible culture. But we also now talk about more and more about the intangible culture. And you have in UNESCO, I noticed that Argentina has at least 3 items of intangible culture that are protected. One of them, of course, is the tango, and by the Argentinian tango, and by intangible culture we mean the living culture. We mean, as I said, the ways of life. So it can be from the food, from the way we create the food. It can be the values that we have, the oral stories that we have, everything that creates our ways of life. And even more recently, we have the idea of the natural culture. So the culture that is very much a part of who we are and our connection with nature. And this again is very much pushed by the indigenous peoples around the world. They have this spiritual connection with the land. But of course, there are other parts like the peasants, a lot of minorities, and also a lot of people in even the majorities in several countries that have this special connection with parts of nature. So we also include that. So you can see immediately that having started from the idea of culture that was something that the elite state admired, we have moved to culture that is much more encompassing, much more comprehensive, and that's why now by culture we mean the way of life. Of course, this creates a bit of vagueness when it comes to what cultural rights are going to protect, because ways of life is, such a huge concept. So it's interesting to see how this has had an impact on the scope and the understanding of cultural rights. If we can move to the next slide. So the international framework of cultural rights is being defined by specific instruments, specific provisions. And of course, I am a lawyer and I would go pretty quickly to the international framework of cultural rights. However, the interpretation of these provisions have to do a lot with the work of anthropologists, of archaeologists, etc. So these are all ammunition, if you want, to go to states and to say that since the state has signed and ratified the relevant instruments, the state is under the legal obligation to protect, to materialize the provisions. So first of all, we have the United Nations in the top layer that I have here. So we have Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and we'll talk about that immediately afterwards. But that protects the right of everyone to participate. It's called the right of everyone to participate in the cultural life. And of course, if a state delegate just read this provision, he would just understand, okay, the right of everyone, so individual right, to participate, only participation, in the cultural life. There is only one culture of the state, and there's only one cultural life. All of these elements are wrong. So that's why we will discuss a little bit more about this provision. And the reason why, because these elements are wrong, is because we also have other instruments that talk about culture. We talk we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 27, that protects the right to culture of minorities. And we also have the very far-reaching document, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that Argentina has been positive towards this declaration. So it has far-reaching provisions on cultural rights. I think essentially, in addition to these provisions, essentially one of the instruments that I deal with every day, the instruments that I deal with every day in my work have to do with non-discrimination. So first of all, it has to do with me explaining to the state that a practice is also part of the right to culture. And then it has to do with comparing the protection of this practice or of this object with the protection of other objects that may belong to the majority understandings and to the majority culture. So non-discrimination is extremely important. Non-discrimination is extremely important for that. Non-discrimination also extremely important when the culture and the cultural rights may be in conflict with specific other rights. The rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of believers. What we have with unfortunate event with Salman Rushdie a couple of days ago, where he was injured, and the argument is that, well, okay, but his writings go against the freedom of religion. So non-discrimination is extremely important in my mandate. What is also extremely important in my mandate is to have a very open mind. And I think in general, when we talk about cultural rights, not to see just the trees, but to see the forest. And in order to do this, we have to go beyond the United Nations. The Inter-American System of Human Rights Protection has been amazing when it comes to cultural rights. The court has come up with the notion of cultural integrity when it comes to indigenous rights, linking it to land rights of indigenous peoples. But more generally, in the remedies that the court has asked states to implement, there are a lot of cultural elements. So the change of road signs that would reflect the names of the victims, that's an amazing expression of the culture. And other such remedies. So the court has been the Inter-American System of Human Rights Protection, the court and the commission have been very central in expanding and promoting a very imaginative and even at times innovative understanding of culture and cultural rights and usage of culture to promote human rights. So it would be a huge overlook if somebody did not take into account the regional systems, and in specific, the regional system in your area. We also have UNESCO and the instruments that UNESCO has. We have to keep in mind that UNESCO is not a human rights organization. So it talks about culture, but it protects culture. So the way I try to think of it is that UNESCO protects the cultures. My mandate protects the rights of the people on this culture. And although at times the two are connected, sometimes the two are separated. In any case, UNESCO has, again, in the last 20 years, has done huge, excellent steps in order to democratize and push forward the concept and the protection of culture. And finally, we have WIPO, so the World International Intellectual Property Organization. I wish I could be as positive about this organization as well. Okay, let me think. WIPO is important because in practice, we have learned that a lot of officials in WIPO do help indigenous peoples, for example, and marginalized peoples, marginalized groups to protect their culture through the system of WIPO. So, we should not be extremely negative. In practice, WIPO does protect to a degree marginalized cultures. However, The whole system of WIPO is still very much based on an individual outlook, and very much seeing culture as consumerism, culture as a commodity. Whereas I think that now we have moved from culture as a commodity to culture as we said, a way of life, something that you cannot, it's not just about buying and selling. So these are the main areas I go to when I have to deal with cultural rights and my mandate. Next slide, please. So I told you, I promised you that we will look very quickly at the Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I have to remind you that these are treaties that the states have signed and ratified, and if they have done so, I think that this treaty has been signed and ratified by almost 180 states. And if they have done so, this means, and this is what states, sometimes are not very eager to announce to the world, this means that they are legally bound by these provisions. So these are not these aspirations. So we have a lot of states that say to us, we are trying and we're trying to do this. No. This is about what they have, but sometimes they say it's against our national law. Well, but that's why they signed and ratified this provision, in order to change their national law. This is the whole idea. They, under their national sovereignty, they decided to sign and ratify these legal instruments. So just the fact that we don't, in international law in the United Nations, don't have somebody to drag a state to prison does not mean that these are not legally binding instruments. So Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights says the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone, click, to take part in cultural life, to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications, to benefit from the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. And then the second paragraph talks about the steps. So the states have to take specific steps in order to ensure that the right is realized. And the states undertake the freedom to respect scientific research and creative activity. Then the provision talks about international contacts and cooperation. So if we go to the next slide to see how the first part is being implemented. So the first part of the provision required a lot of discussions, because the right of everyone to take part, as I told you, in cultural life created problems on its interpretation. And then in 2009, we have General Comment 21 on Article 15 of the Covenant. And the General Comment 21, which I may remind you, it's not legally binding, but it has added value. Recognizes that we're talking about the right of everyone, including communities. So it gives a collective element. So the right suddenly becomes not only individual, but collective as well, to act freely. And also it has to change a culture, to engage in one's own cultural practices. So it's not just about the cultural practice of the state. And also that the General Comment also said that the states have specific obligations to take measures to materialize that. And the right to participation in cultural life means the right to benefit from cultural values created by the individual or the community. So if we can go to the slide further up, please, the previous slide for a second. That's the next. Okay, so how do we interpret this, which is the main provision about cultural rights? Everyone has the right, everyone and every community have the right to their culture. There is not one cultural life, there are several cultural lives, and all of them have to be protected. They all have to be protected because all cultures are of equal value. most cultures include illiberal practices, and we have to discuss these and stop these if indeed they are illiberal. And this is going to be defined and decided by the people who are affected by these so-called illiberal practices. However, in these cultural lives, the state, and it's the state, it's not the individuals themselves, it's the state that has the responsibility in principle to take measures to protect these cultures. And when we talk about to take part, this take part is very passive. Now we know that it is not just to take part, it is to participate actively, to lead some of these programs. And if we do talk about marginalized groups, we combine this with the rights of minorities, the rights of indigenous peoples, and they have to lead the programs that are about them. So as a European white woman, I am not going to go to the indigenous peoples and tell them, this is how you're going to protect their culture. I know, this is how you're going to protect their culture, your culture. In the same way that I'm not going to go to the indigenous peoples and say, I know, you are oppressed. Indigenous women, you're oppressed. You just don't know about it. No. What is going to happen is I'm going, as a UN Special Rapporteur, as an academic, I'll make sure that the state creates all these avenues to ensure that and to ensure that these communities feel safe in order to revise their own practices, and also to develop their cultures. The second part that I wanted to say is that you see that B says that they should benefit. So when we talk about museums, for example, I hear very often this discussion, well, we shouldn't encourage tribalism. We cannot take the cultural objects from all the museums to return them back to every single cultural group where these objects belong to. And I think this is a very valid argument. And I think that sometimes, we like things to be black or white because they make things easier for us. But I think that indeed, this is a valid argument. We should not kind of encourage tribalism and, everything to be within our, everything that we have created as a community to hold and to control. We should let it in the world, okay, but why don't we give some benefits? The British Museum, the Athens Museum, if some benefits to the local community. I remember I went to France some years ago to a fantastic exhibition about the lives of migrants, and it was the migrants themselves that participated in creating this exhibition. So this is what Article 15 is all about, the way we interpret it after having taken into account the current interpretations of human rights. So 2 slides down now, please. Okay, so just to tell you, and now we're talking about marginalized groups and my priorities, as I said in my interview, but also in my first report that was published, I think 6 months ago. My priority is going to be the cultural rights of marginalized persons, and when we talk about marginalized persons, we talk about minorities, and in minorities, it is extremely important, as I mentioned to you, the right to participate effectively. So not to be just a token Black person or Afro-Caribbean that is going to be in the board of a museum, but to participate actively and at times to lead the programs that are being created that affect them, and also the programs that do not affect them. The programs generally in museums have more curators, more artists. So, and also interculturalism, the involvement in the teaching of history, I come from an area in the world. Maybe you know a bit of the problems that Greece had for a long time with Turkey. So there is this threat of Turkey that, and I grew up as a Greek child. I grew up with this threat. So it was very interesting that for me, what I was taught as a child, the first book that I picked up out of school was how the heroic Greeks were slaughtered by the barbarian Turks. So I was 7, so it was very difficult. It's very difficult to escape from this first fear that is installed in you. I say very often that, and I feel very sad about that I hadn't spoken to a Black person until I think I was in my 20s. So obviously I was very scared. I thought, this is the other. So that's why I think it is extremely important that in our schools, in education, we have interculturalism. And interculturalism is not just for the Roma boys and girls to learn about the majority, not about learning only about the Enlightenment, not about learning about the history of the nation. Interculturalism is also about the majority learning of the histories and the understandings and the realities of the minorities. And I think that states are very good in the first part, and they keep saying how the migrant children should learn the language and the history of the state. Agreed. But they're not very good at the second part, which is how the majority children should learn about, in my country, the Albanian history, because we have Albanian migrants, or the Syrian problems, because we have a lot of Syrian asylum seekers. So I think this idea of interculturalism, some people call it intraculturalism, is very important, especially when it comes to the teaching of history. And this is how they should also be infused in citizenship lessons. We have to remember that minority rights are still considered individual rights, so we don't recognize rights of minority. International law does not recognize rights of minorities per se. If we go to the next slide. Uh, And we see a lot of problems when it comes to marginalized people, when it comes to development and how development heritage, the cultural heritage and the cultural rights are being pushed back in the name of development. So what is very important when it comes to marginalized groups and the priorities that my mandate have to do with balancing the rights. So of course, there are going to be conflicts between rights. That's the whole idea of human rights. There are always conflicts between rights. What we need to do is we need to balance these rights. And in order to do that, we need to, first of all, take the opinions of the people themselves, but also promote legality, legitimacy, and proportionality. Proportionality is very important. Next slide. And I think that the big idea about this balancing one can find in the balancing between cultural rights and rights of women. For example, the UK, the United Kingdom, has said that they do not accept collective cultural rights because this has an impact on women's rights. However, you can see that maybe the way to go forward would be by accepting cultural rights in their collective capacity and women's rights also, and just try to balance the two. Next slide. And when it comes to indigenous peoples, we do have the collective right to culture. We do have the provision that indigenous people should give their free, prior, and informed consent. We have the declaration, as I told you, of the rights of indigenous peoples that has far-reaching rights. So, and shows the path for the expansion of other cultural rights. So they talk about intellectual property rights, they talk about restitution and redress, and they talk about a collective, that indigenous peoples have in general collective right to culture. But what is really important is that they talk about the free, prior, and informed consent, that indigenous peoples should give their free, prior, and informed consent. Unfortunately, this is something that a lot of states do not perform, and this is what my mandate has been trying to push forward. I don't want to take too much more time because I'm looking forward to the questions. I just want to say two words about my priorities. This is the and what I have encountered so far. So this is the legal framework. These are the tools that I have in order to work with states to improve cultural rights. It is true, what I have encountered is that, first of all, it is true that there is some kind of lack of full understanding of the full scope of cultural rights. Some states say that cultural rights are only individual rights. Some states say that cultural rights are about the national culture, etc. So my mandate is very eager to explain to states and to the civil society the extent to which cultural rights are recognized. The second priority that we have is the priority to protect the art. I think that states are very eager to protect the art as long as the art is not does not attack them. And unfortunately, in Latin America, we see a lot of states that become very defensive when art is provocative. But art is supposed to be provocative. It is supposed to be, at times, it will be distasteful. And at times, it will also be offensive. But the whole idea is that the paradox is that it is this lack of taste, it is this provocation, it is this offense that art creates that makes us as a society reevaluate our values and who we are and how we want to proceed. So for this reason, states have to be extra careful not to restrict arts and artists. We have a lot of exiled artists that come from various parts of the world where they say that their political meanings are being shut down by the states. So paradoxically, if the states accept the provocative and art, they help the cohesion, if anything, of the society. So this is one priority. The second priority for me is development and cultural rights. We see a lot of neglect of cultural rights in development processes. My current report that is going to be presented in the General Assembly is going to be on development and cultural rights. And there I talk a lot about the rights of participation and free, prior, and informed consent of marginalized groups. And then I also think that I'm very eager to talk about the alternative cultural practices. So we're very, in the world, we're very eager to dismiss cultures of marginalized groups. So we don't talk about cultural practices. We tend to be very discriminatory when it comes to, migrant culture. They're not developed. All migrants, overgeneralizations. So starting from a cultural practice that indeed may be liberal, we make these huge announcements to the world, and then we dehumanize people, and through dehumanizing people, we can violate further their rights. And finally, in my mandate, I want to show how culture is a tool for empowerment. It's a tool for the protection of human rights. So in my academic life, I have created, together with media experts, we have created an online game for migrant children, so that that teaches them their rights. as children. So I want to emphasize this, and I am counting on the experts' help and collaboration. I still consider myself a newbie in this world, and I count on you to promote the cultural rights and continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Xanthaki, for sharing your point of view, your perspective with us. We stay eager for the second part of your exposition. We would like to share with you that here in Argentina, cultural rights based on that treaties that you mentioned were included on a constitutional basis, because all treaties on human rights hold a constitutional level in our legal system. As a cultural manager, I will surely have said this not neatly, because here my lawyer colleagues will surely express it better, but I think that's distinctive on the Argentinian law system. In the next moment, we would like to hear from Professor Humberto Cunha from the University of Fortaleza in Brazil, a brief background on the debates on cultural rights here in our region, in South America, to let afterwards three of our companions from our working group on cultural rights to share with you three questions. So please, Humberto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fred. Dear Professor Alexandra Xanthaki, it's a great pleasure to meet you and an honor to have the opportunity to say a few words to you. I thank and congratulate the Study and Research Group on Cultural Rights in Argentina for giving me this opportunity, for the trust placed in me, and for having decided to seek information and dialogue with a person as qualified as our speaker. Consider the Universal Declaration for Human Rights from 1948. The expression cultural rights has been circulating around the planet for more than 7 decades. If we look at specific cultural rights, such as the right to education, they are already more than centenarians, as they were present in the first constitution with a social profile. Despite these facts, cultural rights still receive designations such as prodigal children of human rights and undeveloped rights, among others. Cinderella was said here. And I ask, why does it happen? Certainly, this is a relevant problem, and therefore it usually has several causes, which need to be taken simultaneously, otherwise the problem will persist. Identifying such causes is an additional challenge that demands investigation. However, some hypotheses can be presented. One of these hypotheses, the only one alluded to the lack of time, is related to the definition and therefore to dimensioning of cultural rights. In my book, in Portuguese, Teoria dos Direitos Culturais, Fundamentos e Finalidades, in English, Theory of Cultural Rights, Fundaments and Purposes, referring to the Brazilian journal Revista Observatório Itaú Cultural number 11, I reported that Farida Sharid, the first independent expert in the field of cultural rights, appointed by the Human Rights Council of United Nations, when answering in 2011 the question, which rights can be classified as cultural, the specialist anchored herself in the list of those that are occasionally mentioned in international documents. Without mentioning theoretical parameters to configure them, she established as one of the main goals of her mandate to research more on how to better distinguish the human rights that can be considered cultural, and also how to better define the content of these rights in a preliminary way. In her beautiful first report presented to the United Nations Human Rights Committee entitled Cultural Rights: An Empowering Agenda, by which she introduces her plan of action, our honorable speaker, Mrs. Xanthaki, she also appeared to prefer the security of normativity, as can be seen in the topic 2 legal framework, in which she emphasized the best known article of declarations and conventions dealing with cultural rights in the presentation also. This tendency to use rules to treat and attribute value to cultural rights has also permitted in the last 30 years the so-called new Latin American constitutionalism, characterized precisely by phrasing elements so valued in the significant academic work of Alexandra Xanthaki: indigenous culture, minorities, and the environment, elements evidenced by the expression here, Pachamama, which gives our planet the title of mother and values the female figure, something deeply related in terms of conception of the idea of Gaia emanating from the mythical Hellenic word, her country of origin. From this conception, the constitutions and a significant numbers of law from Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, among others, greatly increased their list of cultural rights. Also, the essay on regional documents or academic sketches, such as the Iberic American Charter of Cultural Rights and the Freiburg Declaration, go in the same direction. However, some of the problems related to these rights persist, such as lack of promotion, cultural exclusions, and lack of respect for diversity, which includes censorship practices. This premise leads to the hypothesis that, unlike other legal disciplines, which can be known only by the method they deal with or the specification of legal precepts, cultural rights are much more complex because, in addition to a multiplicity of matters it deals with, legal relation on the arts, collective memory, and flow of knowledge, they can only be understood from a fine trans-temporal balance, where the past teach us experiences, the present enable us to experience new things, and the future should guide us toward improved experience. And for the fulfillment of great goals that humanity has set for itself: dignity, development, and peace. Understanding this complexity will allow us to make some distinctions between any cultural manifestation from another that can boost the status of a cultural right. And within the scope of these rights, we will be able to give precision to the declarations and conventions as well as create guarantees that make the rights foreseen therein effective. Under this premise, I would like to ask, do you see it as an important task for an academic community to seek a definition of cultural rights? Second, does this have the potential to help in the elaboration, understanding, dissemination, and realization of these rights? And finally, what precautions should be adopted in the development of this task if it is desirable? Thank you very much.
Sorry, the third question, Professor Filho, thank you so much. The third question that you said, what?
What precaution,
steps?
What steps, not steps, carry, what precautions carrying, you can, precauções, dá para você traduzir aí?
Precautions, yes, of course. Precautions. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it very well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Obrigado, professor Cunha Filho. Um prazer para nós de ter você aqui. Estamos a mudar entre portugués, inglés y español. Entonces, ahora vamos a pedirle a 3 colegas del grupo de estudios que compartan sus preguntas con la doctora Xanthaki, a quien se las hemos adelantado en inglés para que ella pueda address them, que pueda responderlas. Vamos a pedirle entonces a Mercedes Chapman, del Colegio de Abogados de Córdoba, a Marcelo Cebrián, del Colegio de Abogados de Bahía Blanca, y a Norma Lebrand, de la Universidad Nacional del Litoral, que compartan sus preguntas con la doctora Xanthaki.
Buenos días. El uso de la categoría derechos culturales por parte de los actores del sector cultural en Sudamérica se ha incrementado a nivel discursivo, sin que necesariamente cambien los enfoques o se transformen las prácticas. ¿Qué sugerencias se pueden transmitir a los defensores de los derechos culturales en nuestra región para aumentar la sensibilidad y la conciencia de las poblaciones sobre sus derechos culturales?
Sí, buenos días. La segunda pregunta es, desde el punto de vista de la exigibilidad de los derechos culturales, nos preocupa ver políticas culturales públicas con tendencia al asistencialismo con limitada participación real de las comunidades. ¿Cómo sugiere la Relatoría abordar el desarrollo de procesos centrados en la percepción de estas comunidades sobre sus derechos culturales y el papel del Estado en su garantía? Muchas gracias.
Buenos días. Considerando los teóricos que han diagnosticado una crisis de la democracia representativa y teniendo presente que varios documentos de UNESCO y otras organizaciones internacionales promueven el involucramiento de las comunidades en las decisiones sobre derechos culturales, quisiera preguntarle cuáles son los criterios que deberían orientar a los estados para consultar a las comunidades sobre decisiones o políticas públicas relativas a derechos culturales, ya que evidentemente no todas las decisiones podrían ser abiertas al debate público.
So we switch languages again. Dr. Xanthaki, the floor is yours again. If you could please address in some sense these questions, and afterwards give us the ending, the close that you prefer. I would like to thank you again for holding this meeting with us and to begin to establish stronger connections within your mandate and our region.
Thank you very much. And many thanks to Mrs. Lebrand, many thanks to Mr. Cebrian, and many thanks to Miss Chapman who spoke. Or am I right? No, I'm sorry, Miss Colombato. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending. But I don't thank you for the very difficult questions. These are really difficult questions. But also huge thanks to Professor Filho, who took the time to obviously really focus on the discussion for today and make such pertinent observations that go through the whole mandate. And I think that what Professor said is very much in line with what I was talking about, this idea of how the meaning of cultural rights has changed and the meaning of cultures, the scope of cultural right. I would fully agree with him. And I would also fully agree with him that my talk was very law related and very, there's a lot of normativity. I guess I think that in this specific role, what I want to do is to explain in different ways to states, but also to individuals, that human rights are the responsibility of states and they have to take measures. A lot of states just seem to push the ball to the civil society. And I think that we have, and now it's the new, the transnational corporations. And of course, transnational corporations have a lot to answer for. But in human rights, the state continues to be the main violator and the main entity that has to protect human rights and cultural rights. I think that you are absolutely right, and I would strongly encourage the continuing the dialogue about what culture is and what cultural rights are. My mandate we're trying to find resources in order to come up with a leaflet that will explain in very clear terms the various aspects of cultural rights, but we need to do a lot more work on this. And we rely to a very large degree on your part of the world because you have the academic strength, and we saw this in the discussion and in the questions. You also have excellent experiences, the multicultural pot that Latin America is. So we rely very much, and in many ways, the states of Latin America and the civil society of Latin America have gone beyond the discussions that at least sometimes we see in Europe. So yes, I fully agree that there should continue to be a discussion on definition and the scope of culture and cultural rights. I guess the precautions, and I am very grateful, Professor, for taking time to make your talk in English so that I can understand, and I'm really sorry. Spanish is such a beautiful language, and generally I should be able to communicate in Spanish and Portuguese. So the precautions. I guess I would have the same. Reluctance that I have with definitions in general in law. So if you are accusing, if you are cautioning me when it comes to my normativity, and you're absolutely right, and I take it on board. I think that we should be very cautious when it comes to inflexible definitions. So we see this with minorities. When states do not want to recognize any further rights to minorities, they start the old discussion of, well, yes, but who is a minority? So if we expect the state to reach, all the states or any state to reach a specific definition or exclusive definition of what is culture or what is cultural right, we will never go to the second part, which is to recognize, and actually the third part, which is to implement the cultural rights. So I think that this is my precautions. This is the first precaution. The second precaution is that, definitions can be expansive, definitions can be restrictive. And I'm very worried, for example, in the state where I live, in the UK, the definition would be more restrictive than the international understanding of it. So although I think that, because, for example, the UK does not accept collective rights, so the collective element is going to be put in question. So for this reason, I think that, yes, of course, let's continue the discussion, but at the same time, let's not reach any definitions written in stone. Let's continue to evolve the discussion. And I think that's very important. As far as the other questions that were asked, and again, thank you very much for these. So the first question is the suggestions to increase the sensitivity and awareness of populations about their cultural rights. And I think that in this question, I would first of all, again, you know, I know that I get tiring, but I think that it is the state that should first of all understand the definition of and the steps and what it means, what cultural rights actually mean, and it is the state that is going to take steps for the population. I think that the most important bit is to speak on human rights terms and to put cultural rights in the human rights framework. And sometimes we see that this is not done. I'm not sure about Argentina, but in other places we see that very often. So human rights are placed in cultural rights are placed in the part of aspirations or etc. So I think that this is very important. I think that we should also not reject parts of cultural rights that are difficult. So when we talk about the artistic freedom for some states is difficult, and that's why they exclude it. Indigenous cultural rights for some states is difficult. Intangible cultural rights is difficult. Then I think it is important to recognize that these elements will need balancing and to go around the world explaining in very secure terms that, of course, you know, all human rights, including cultural rights, need balancing. There are conflicts. This is the whole idea of human rights. There are ongoing conflicts all the time, but it is up to us to find how to balance it. And international law has given us tools to do so, and we should use these tools to do so. And also, I think that what is very important is to always this intraculturalism, always to create opportunities, and so cultural rights are only going to be learned by experience. So always create opportunities for the exchange of information and the exchange of practices. So as Professor will as the professor will see, hopefully in a bit when you go to have the dinner with your family, and I go to have the dinner in my family, it is, you know, with a glass of wine that we learn the culture of the other one, and rather than kind of having the highbrow intellectual discussion all the time. So this interaction, I think, is extremely important. So these are, I guess, some of the ways that I would see important in conveying the cultural rights. Cultural rights come when multiculturalism exists, but for multiculturalism to exist, we need real multiculturalism, not each culture being segregated and viewing the other culture as inferior or backwards. So we should be open to cultural diversity. The second question was about, I understood that it was about participation, and I think that I discussed about participation in my talk. I think that it's an excellent question. It is very much about, it is very much a challenge, and in my report, in my forthcoming report, I have to tell you that I and my team had to discuss a lot whether it would be, we would talk about the challenge of participation or the requirement of participation. And we went for the requirement of participation to ensure that states realize that this is a requirement. However, you know, it is a challenge. Who are you going to invite? How are you going to include them? We have to remember that the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, specifies very clearly that the people who are going to be included are going to be decided on the terms of the indigenous community. So because we accept the democratic system, this doesn't mean that we have to impose the system to the indigenous group in order to bring us their representatives. And sometimes it's going to be anarchy, a lot of voices, a lot of discussions. I am very much aware that at the moment there is this ongoing, almost little tension between indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent and rights of peasants to free, prior, and informed consent. So if both of them have free, prior, and informed consent, who prevails, you know, and in the who prevails bit, for me, I always go back to who is more marginalized, because voices, the marginalized, it is the marginalized voices that you have to push up and make more visible, rather than the non-marginalized voices. So I think that this is very important. It is very important not just to allow them to participate, but to lead the programs so that they have ownership of the programs. And to give voice to the marginalized within the marginalized. So, you know, to indigenous peoples, but maybe to women within indigenous peoples, maybe LGBT women within the indigenous group. So this idea that the intersectionality that now we talk about a lot, to give voices to as many people as possible. And of course, to make the participation genuine, not just to have a tick boxing exercise, as some international organizations have been accused to have. Yes, we invited this person, so tick, that's it. Oh, yes, say your bit, and then we'll do what we have decided to do anyway. So these are some of the issues that I would like to see. I think that participation is a huge, if participation is ensured and participation is real, it is a huge step forward. So, for example, just to give you an example, in COVID, and I give this example in my report, my forthcoming report, the General Assembly, in COVID, the whole world was talking about shielding and how we should, and lockdowns and quarantines and how we should all stay at home. And in 200 states, only 2 states thought of asking the indigenous peoples, how have you done it in all these centuries? You have been this practice of shielding and being away from the society. How did you do it? It was only, to my knowledge, it was only New Zealand and Australia that asked indigenous communities to share with them the expertise. Instead, all states viewed indigenous peoples as the victims, how we are going to protect them. So I think that was a huge missed opportunity regarding participation and empowerment. Then finally, very quickly, the third question. The third question has to do, in my understanding, with the collective element of cultural rights. And I think that what I said was that the collective element of cultural rights has now been recognized. And I will insist in saying that, of course, sometimes the collective element is going to be in conflict with some individual rights, in the same way that the cultural practices of majorities are in conflict with some individual rights. In my country, in my culture, there are times where I feel that the fact that I'm a woman is undermined by. Because I'm a woman, my human rights are undermined because of my culture. So it doesn't only have to do. Let's not focus on the lack of some illiberal practices only in minorities. And I think it is very important to recognize the collective element of human rights, to recognize collective rights of specific groups, and then to ensure that everybody within this group has a voice, to push the voices through education, that the professor has said, through informal and formal education, and through specific steps, in order to be able to reach a real representative democracy rather than a democracy of the elite. Sometimes we forget that even the most renowned places of democracy were the democracy of the men and the democracy of the few, not the democracy of all. So thank you so much for bearing with me, and I really enjoyed our talk. I want to especially thank Mr. Escribal for being so patient And I want to thank you all for being here today. And I'm so sorry for taking so much time of so much time of your day.
No, dear Professor,
Out of
it's
my
been-
culture, I talk a lot.
Oh, we are very much the same here. I would like to thank you in name of our collective for your time, especially being a holiday in Greece too. We didn't know that. I would like to apologize with Graciela Ciselli from the Universidad Nacional de la Patagonia, San Juan Bosco, Ezequiel Valicenti from the Universidad Nacional del Centro in Provincia de Buenos Aires, and Lucia Carolina Colombato from the Universidad Nacional de La Pampa, that they didn't get the time to express themselves personally today, but they are part of our collective expression. These three
And
colleagues...
sometimes the facial expressions, you know, it's as if they participated. I
Yes,
could
they
see
had.
them and I could get, you know, the nodding and the expressions. Thank you.
Dr. Xanthaki, this team, these three colleagues are working on a seminar focused on public cultural managers in order to think about the monitoring, evaluation of access to cultural rights based on the Inter-American system.
Oh, fantastic.
And I would like personally very much for you to get to Lucia's work, because she works specifically on the interrelationship between cultural rights and human rights. I think her work is not translated to English, but I will take the task in the next months to see how you in the mandate can know about our work in more academic or conceptual terms. I would like to thank you and your team very much, for dear Joanne and Mylene, for your patience also, because
Thank you. I just want to tell you that we are here. We're very eager to collaborate. We're very eager to continue your discussion as a collectivity, individually, and thank you so much. I have a lamb on the oven waiting for me now, and my father explaining to me, my father is a lawyer, so my father explaining to me how international law is not above national law. So I'd better go and have the normal family cultural discussions.
Thank you very much to all.
Thank you
See
so
you
much.
next time. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Filho. Thank you. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.